Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Pulse Check session. A little bit late for the end of May, but 4th of June today. So a little bit late for May, getting in early in June. No doubt it's going to be a hectic end of financial year here for us, as it always is. But today we're here to talk about politics, something Luke and I love, and Mick puts up with a lot of our political talk here in the office. So, gentlemen, welcome. Look forward to talking about today's topic. You're laughing, Luke, so I'll go to you
Should be a bit of
first.
fun, Tim.
It should be fun. It should be fun, exactly. How are you doing today?
Mate, I'm doing really well, actually. I'm doing really well. Really busy at work, which is always nice, Tim. And as we've just seen, and we've just hot off the press, the government has just announced some changes to some aged care reforms, which apparently were supposed to take place on the 1st of July, but have now been pushed out to the 1st of November, which is, thank you, some common sense finally.
Exactly right. They've come forward with this big reform and then they've delayed it as soon as it got close to kicking off. So that is hot off the press, exactly. Mirko, how are you?
Well, it's probably quite timely that announcement because today's discussion is all about Labor having the majority and the ability to sort of be bold and push stuff through and whatnot. And he's another example of going to do something, but actually maybe we're going to not do it straight away, and maybe we'll kick that can down the road and stuff. So I think there's plenty of examples of that. So. I think today's a good day to be chatting about that, and I'm sure that aged care reform is going to be part of the discussion.
Most definitely. And I like this topic. I'll give Luke credit for this for coming up with this one. But yeah, obviously one we think can impact us in the next couple of years, depending on what happens. But something a little bit different for today. What we're actually going to do, I'm going to share on the screen now a sort of an introductory statement. So I will still read it, but I guess rather than me doing a very long speech with nothing on the screen, I thought we'd pop this up while we talk about it. So gents, just let me know when we can see that one.
Got it.
You can see
Got
it.
it. All right. So, as an introduction to today's session, Anthony Albanese has landed a supermajority in the 48th Parliament, a very, very big majority. I think it's fair to say. So, with obviously his first term, he sort of approached it a bit of a cautious, crowd pleasing sort of a approach to it. But he's now won this election essentially with a 94 seats out of 150. So, very large majority that he's now got to carry forward into this term. And the topic of this session is obviously around how is he going to use that majority. Now, very important point here, and Luke, you were very hot off the press with this one as well. While he's won 94 of 150 seats, they've only won the primary vote there, as it shows, of just under 35%. So essentially, 2/3 of Australia didn't vote for him, 1/3 did. So only a third voted for him, yet they've essentially got 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. So come from a very cozy sort of a situation. Let's get through the first term and see how we go. To, as the article says at the bottom here, what's he going to do this time? Is he going to take that same sort of cautious approach into this term, or is he going to use this majority that he's got to do something truly transformational? Coast, is he going to be what's comfort? Is he going to go for it? And I think the last line really sums it up here. Is he just going to be safe for another term, or is he going to use this to potentially set himself a legacy for a long time to come? John Howard, a good example of someone who came in and was there for a long time and brought in some pretty hard-hitting things such as the GST. So hopefully everyone's had a bit of a chance to read through that, and I've given a pretty good summation of it. But gents, is there something on that screen that you wanted to point out as a starting point, or sort of gone through the key points?
Yeah, look, I think you've nailed the key points, Tim. And I think the challenge is very real for the government at the moment. Yeah, sure, they won a massive majority, and in fairness, for a lot of people, very unexpected too, because the polls were pointing to a lot closer result. And in fairness, if the result went 3% to 4% the other way, that margin would narrow rather significantly. So from that point of view, I don't think they can rest on their laurels. But in saying that, there is a clear pathway for the Labor government now to have perhaps another term and another term thereafter. That's how big the gap is. And the challenge for somebody like an Albanese is, I think the first term, we were all a little bit disappointed with where they went. The second term now is really about, what does he want to do? Does he want to play safe? or does he want to create a legacy? And a legacy is where you create those endearing policies which are for the betterment of the country. So I know before you mentioned things like GST and so on. Yes, that is a reform, but if we think about real reforms and all that kind of stuff, let's talk about things like Medicare. Let's talk about things like superannuation. These are the things that have been around for a very long time. They're a part of the way Australian way of life is from that point of view, and they'd be pretty hard to remove. And I guess this is a challenge for somebody like an Albanese now. Does he go and do something like that and create this new world, or does he play it safe? So that's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Already got a comment here around wonder if they'll backflip on the unrealised self-managed super fund tax now that they've backflipped on the aged care one. Well, that'll be one of the first things we'll talk about in today's session. So we'll get to that one very shortly indeed.
No worries. All right. Well, look, essentially, I guess what we see here, and we had a chat about this before as we were preparing for today's session, Tim, there's probably 6 challenges on the horizon in terms of where the markets currently sit in terms of everything from that end. And these challenges are not small challenges. So these challenges have a massive bearing on the future prosperity of the country, but also for the immediate prosperity of the country. And I think the first thing that we've got to talk about is tax reform. And we can't expect to have world-class services without paying for them. All right. So the reality is at this moment in time, and let's be clear, we all want better hospitals, we all want faster trains, safer roads, better schools. We all want all that sort of stuff, yeah? But the reality is we can't keep on drinking champagne when we've got a beer budget. And that's a fact. Now, we know that tax reform hasn't kept up. We know that the tax take is nowhere near what it should be in terms of maintaining the kind of services that people want. And it's causing a lot of stress into the system. Okay, and the stress is at the moment, in order to keep on funding what we want to do, we have to borrow money. That is not a solution, and that is a structural deficit that needs to be resolved from that end. So at this moment in time, if we look at the tax system, the way it's being built, the tax system is very much weighted in favour of the older generation, with superannuation concessions, negative gearing, capital gain discounts and the like. And the younger people coming through, the younger generations, are copying it in the backside in terms of the obligations on them from that point of view. So there's a lot of inequality in the system, and there's a lot of discussions, I guess, from that point of view. And some of the policy ideas that are being thrown up at this moment in time are things like caps or superannuation concessions, so the $3 million unrealised gain things and the likes. There's also discussions around phasing out negative gearing. There's discussions around reducing capital gains tax rates discounts, and there's discussions around an inheritance tax, and do we introduce something like that? And do we also revisit GST? So these are some of the policy ideas being thrown about. I'm now going to throw it over to you two. What do you think will happen?
Well, before we kick it off, it's a shame I don't have cameras in individual homes of the people on screen, because I reckon a few of them would have just killed over just then and there and disappeared. We will reiterate that these are the things that we are hearing around the traps. These are the whispers, and to be perfectly honest, they're sort of the natural focus of attention for governments, because they're what I would deem as sort of low-hanging fruit, on that front. The government went in with the unrealised capital gains tax on the $3 million on the superannuation. It does actually sound like they're going to try and push that through, and I don't know how they're going to manage it. And I think if we even, talking about that aged care reform that we saw this morning, you might find that, policy gets pushed through, but it might be a while before they can actually implement that into the equation. What do you guys reckon?
Tend to agree, and it's fascinating, isn't it, that they're talking about pushing this through, but it's defined benefit is exempt from that rule. Obviously, a lot of politicians having defined benefit superannuation schemes, but
surprise,
exactly. You said too, Luke, you can't drink champagne on a beer budget. I don't know if you've bought beer lately, but that's pretty expensive. So if they could lower the cost of that down a bit as well, that'd be handy. But no, sorry, coming back to superannuation. No, look, I'm with you there, Mick. It's certainly going to have a big impact, and there's already challenges around it. Are farms going to be exempt for that, or is there some way to get around that? Because if you've got a chunky asset within a fund, how are you actually going to pay the tax if all of the fund sits in a large, asset? We've talked about can't sell an acre of land, can't sell a bedroom, all those sort of things. So there's definitely challenges facing at that. But I think if we go more broadly with superannuation, look, there's plenty of things we could probably pick apart in that one as well. Not just taxing balances over $3 million. Do they restrict how much people can put into superannuation? Do we, dare I say, and we've spoken about this on this screen, low-hanging fruit, do we have tax on pension phase all of a sudden? At the moment, we can have 0% earning tax on pension funds. Is that something that they look at bringing in?
I think so, Tim. I think, look, the reality is the idea of taxing unrealised gains is a change to our tax system. I'm really uncomfortable with taxing something where you actually haven't triggered off a transaction. This becomes a quasi land tax grab. If you think about the way land tax is calculated, because obviously, that's how the state governments collect their revenues, in the sense of we'll tax you because you haven't sold the property, and that's part of the fund. This seems to be the way our tax system's going, and it's a complete deviation to what we're accustomed to. I do think superannuation needs to be looked in its entire context. The reality is it's concessionally taxed at 15%. So that's earnings are concessionally taxed whilst in the accumulation phase. And you're right, in the pension phase, it is zero all the way up to $2 million. So it's incredibly generous when you think about it. So a husband and wife could have $4 million in super and not pay a cent of tax anyway, if they were in the pension phase. Do they come up with a universal earning rate inside of superannuation or inside of the pension phase, and perhaps make it at 10% or whatever it might be? Do they do that for, where they might do it and say, well, okay, the typical Australian balance or the typical Australian person who's in their early 60s might only have 500,000, so the first 500,000 doesn't count, and anything above the 500,000 counts? I'm not sure. I'd really like to see it on actual declared earnings, not unrealised earnings, because trying to manage that, let's not kid ourselves. This morning they moved the aged care reforms because they were nowhere near ready. They haven't got a hope in hell of managing this $3 million thing. In truth, the ATO isn't built for it. And, Mick and I have been around long enough. Tim, this was before your time. But, the old RBL days, the mess that caused, the chaos that caused, no one knew what was going on from that perspective, made advice more complicated. And no one won, to the point where the ATO themselves said, we can't do it.
I am a bit old. I did learn about RBLs. You'll be fascinated to know this. I did learn about RBLs in uni, and it was literally taught with, you're going to learn this or you're never going to use this because next year this gets phased out. So I didn't practice it, but I did learn it.
There you go. So yeah, look, I do think there needs to be a broader discussion around super, and I think, at the end of the day, and whilst we will have some of our clients will sit back and go, that's not fair. I followed the rules. I paid the monies in, and I did it under good faith, and all that kind of stuff. And I understand all the arguments, but at the moment, what's happening here is you're asking the younger generation to subsidise a tax-free outcome. That's what's happening. No matter how we look at this, that's the reality of what's happening. So, and I don't know if the younger generation is too keen on subsidising the tax outcome for people that are on the wealthier side.
It's interesting the point you made there, Luke, about the first 500,000 is exempt and anything above that is taxed potentially. And me immediately looks at that and goes, that's creating more complexity in the system. But it's probably more of a Labor way of attacking it, is exempt at the bottom and more at the top, rather than just going 5% across the board. So I think there's certainly merit in what you're saying there.
Yeah, look, for mine, it just kind of, it seems to be, because ultimately what you want to do is, or you tax it all, and then you give a refund for the first 500,000.
Yep.
So you can do it in reverse. So everyone gets taxed to find a way to do it less thing. So that's on the superannuation side. I do think, Tim, and I'm, and I know you and I have had a disagreement on this one, the inheritance tax, I do think that is staring at us in the face. I've never seen so many articles appear in the Australian, in the Age, in the AFR. Virtually now on a monthly basis, you're getting 2 to 3 articles on inheritance tax. 2 years ago, this wasn't mentioned.
No.
It didn't exist. All of a sudden now, and we are one of the only OECD nations that doesn't have it. So I think that's an issue. I think the other thing there too is I don't think they're going to be anywhere near as brave on negative gearing, because I think, every drover's dog has one or feels like they have one. So I think you'd be really upsetting the entire electorate if you went down the negative gearing route. You may want to put a cap on the amount of properties you could have, perhaps. That might work. But I think the capital gains one, as in the discount provision, which is today 50%, yeah, I don't know if that's going to be as generous as.
I agree with that. I think there's a very good chance that doesn't get scrapped, but that gets cut from maybe 50% down to 25%. And the negative gearing one you just mentioned there, I'm with you. Maybe it's not on 8 properties, but maybe your negative gearing is limited to 1 or 2 properties. And trust me, there's plenty of younger people out there that don't own a home saying, oh, what? So the guy with a home plus 2 investment properties is still getting treated well. But yeah, you risk that if you go too hard on that, you throw the whole property market into disarray. So there's plenty of different things to come into that equation. Like you said, with inheritance tax, I'm just, it feels to me like a massive money grab throwing that in, just as all this wealth is about to transfer, you throw that in. But in terms of enforcing that, not exactly difficult because probate obviously lists the value of the estate. So whacking a percentage-based tax on that is not going to be too difficult to impose. So what do you think, Mick? What's your view on the inheritance tax?
As you guys were talking, I've written down unintended consequences, and I think against all of those, little ones that we've mentioned there could be a raft of unintended consequences. I mean, we're already seeing some people doing some interesting things with superannuation right now based on potential legislation, let alone if it actually gets through. So it might change people's behaviours, and I think it'll be very interesting to see where this one goes. I mean, the other option, just thinking out aloud, is that at the moment you can rip out money out of superannuation as lump sums, in any capacity that you like to, and inadvertently, avoid tax altogether. Perhaps the government actually leaves that to a situation where you must take it as an income stream of sorts, so that eventually one day, when the assets fall to non-dependence, tax will be paid. It could be another variation on that. But some of the things mentioned there, and I will point out as well. I know we're sort of hard on the boomers who seem to be getting all these benefits and whatnot, but the young people have got access to all this stuff too. Right now, superannuation is not as sexy when you don't have a home and you're trying to make your way and put kids through school and whatnot. But things like negative gearing and CGT discounts, they've got access to all that stuff too that they can use to their advantage. Yeah. So let's not forget that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other thing there worth mentioning too, and just for the benefit of the boomer too, the boomer was paying up until about 1999, was paying top marginal rate at 60 grand.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Let's not forget that too. Yeah. So we've kind of put that away. So they have paid their fair share of tax, and they've done the right things from that end. But the reality there is, I guess it's a question of what sort of a country do we want to be moving forward. If we want good aged care, if we want good hospitals, if we want good roads, if we want good systems, from a mental health point of view, and we want all these things in play, and we want to be a more fairer, equitable society without it becoming a quasi, Scandinavian type approach. If we want to do all those things, we're going to have to pay for it. And at the moment, we can't make money grow on trees. So the only way we can do it is by collecting taxes. So tax reform, if the Albanese had any sort of gumption and any sort of bravery, they would be going down that path. Whether or not they implement any of this or take it to the next election, that's the question.
Yeah. One other thing quickly on this point while we're here, and this is something I've sort of flagged a few times, is do they tinker with GST? Do they increase the rate? Do they increase or incorporate some different things into that? I guess at a high level, what's your view on that? Do you think that's a potential option? Or given that was a Liberal policy and the Liberal Party said they would never increase that, you leave that alone, but rather than being the party that tinkered with it?
Yeah, look for mine, Tim, I think we've got to move away with words like we'll never do it or phrases. I think that's stupid. I think that just puts you into a corner and gets you into a lot of trouble. The world has changed. Things have moved on. Do we need to tinker with the GST? Absolutely. GST today is sitting at 10%. There's carve-outs in terms of food, there's carve-outs in terms of education and essential services and all that kind of stuff. It's a complicated, convoluted system, and requires, a lot of inputs, a lot of advice inputs and so on. It'd be so much simpler if we just said it applies universally across the board and it's at a higher rate. And again, if you then want to compensate the ones that are impacted, you can actually provide that through increased pension benefits, or tax offsets, whatever it might be for the low income earners. So they're not worse off. But ultimately, a consumption tax or a GST is the fairest tax. People with more money spend more money. End of story.
Yep, absolutely. Any extra comments on that one, Mick, or happy to leave that one?
No, I was actually thinking about something else. We talked about drinking champagne on a beer budget and all that sort of stuff, and expecting world-class services and all that. And I don't have any problems with trying to solve the budget issues, by finding a way. And if it is tax or some tweaks around there that are justified and make sense, I can live with that. But what I can't live with is how that money then gets deployed and the lack of accountability around that, right? So there's nothing worse than actually watching taxpayer money literally thrown away, and we have numerous examples of that both at state and federal governments. I think we need to, as a broader issue, address that and say, well, how do we get to a point where we say the people that are deploying these assets are actually accountable for something? Because right now nobody is. Budget blowouts of billions of dollars don't mean anything, right? They do in the real world, but not when you're in la la land with the government. That's for sure.
Yeah, budget blowout of a few million or a few billion in private companies send people broke, right, and lose jobs. But in the government, it's glossed over, and we're sort of almost used to that now. So anyway, I'm conscious of time. I thought I would move on to the next point if we're happy with that, gents, which is decarbonisation isn't optional. It's our next big economic shift. And there's no doubt with the younger generation coming through, they're very keen on green energy and this chase to net zero eventually, whenever that time comes. So look, there's obviously we've talked about nuclear, gas, coal, all those sort of things. There's no doubt green energy. This is a push that is coming, whether we like it or not. It's how we get there is the more important issue. So I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I might start with you if it's okay, Luke. Thoughts on how we tackle that and some potential policy ideas we've got.
Yeah, look, Tim, I think for mine, and this is not a young person thing, I think even the older generation would sit back and go, actually, they want to leave the world in a better place. Because why? They've got their own kids, they've got grandkids, so self-interest still drives this, yeah?
Yeah, fair, sorry.
And they want to create a future. Okay, so in saying that, I think the biggest problem that we've had is there's been policy uncertainty, and there really hasn't been a landing space for people to sit back and go, we can actually go and implement policy or implement ideas or solutions or invent things with certainty, thinking that it's going to be around. Yeah. So that's probably the first thing that needs to happen. So I think we actually need to commit to a plan and agree on a plan and say, this is where we're going to go. And that plan needs to be, this is where we would like to end up, but this is the transition to get to the plan. So that's one of the things that I'd like to think. The other thing, and I still don't understand this, and I hope you two gentlemen can help me on this point, we as a country are loaded, from what I understand, with gas resources, which we extract out of the ground, extract out of the oceans and all that kind of stuff, put into boats, send overseas to then repurchase and bring back to Australia to then sell to Australian consumers at inflated prices. I don't understand how we can't revisit those contracts, whatever they are in play, because ultimately these are our assets that we just seem to be giving away and not receiving anything for. And if you look at the Nordic states, their wealth funds have been built on this rubbish. And the reason why they can do what they do and they're not having the same problems that we've got is because they've been collecting these things. So maybe that rent resources tax or that, remember that thing they were talking about in terms of, when Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd were around, which I still didn't understand it, but is that a plausible option? I'm not sure. Brave.
You're on mute, Mick.
Mick, you're on silent.
Probably a better thing. I just thinking about the gas solution. The mind boggles because that's basically how it works. And on that note, I noticed that we recently approved the Northwest Shelf, LNG, and we've extended the life of that. But even sort of the way that was handled, it took 6.5 years to get that approval. I mean, if you're like a Woodside sitting out there, wanting to deploy billions of dollars in capital investment and the like, and you're just sitting there waiting for this decision to be made by the powers that be, and then all of a sudden the decision's made. It actually not a lot of rhetoric around how it was made or why it was made and a lot. And it's not part of a bigger picture scenario where we sit back and say, this is why we've done it, because we need the gas because we don't have enough in by way of renewables, and this is how we're resolving that problem when the life of this project ends. We don't have those discussions. We seem to be doing little bits of patchwork here. We
Mm.
shut down discussion around nuclear, but then we get
Mhm.
told in the middle of summer to tone it down with the air conditioners because we don't have enough power.
Mm.
I mean, please, yeah, we're not having that broader discussion.
Mm. Obviously, we've had solar
Tim,
around
what's your move, Tim? Sorry, Tim. What's your you had a view on batteries and the like from that point of view,
as
or
I
you
say,
had a vision there that you'd like to?
Mick doesn't want to hear my view on things clearly, so no, that's I'm
Yes, he does.
stirring him up. No, I was going to say that was going to be one of the ones I raised was obviously a big shift towards green manufacturing and solar panels and bits and pieces like that. But the battery one is one that's always fascinated me. Is today lots of people don't have batteries in their house; they have solar panels, produce excess power, but then to sort of Mick's point before, it circles around like we give it back to the grid for nothing, and then we buy it back again at an inflated price. So you're sitting here going, well, people are actually producing enough solar power in their houses. Why are they not having batteries to keep it? And it comes down to the cost and the sort of the value benefit of that is by the time you pay for them and the warranty on them is not great, you run the risk of losing money off it. So it's not there. There's not enough incentive there. So I would be thinking that that's probably something we could pay a bit more attention to because if we give concessions on batteries or we give rebates on batteries in some way, shape, or form, not only are you going to encourage people to buy batteries, that's obviously going to mean you're encouraging them to put solar panels on their roof, which is going to reduce that drain on electricity, like Mick spoke about. Less people drawing from the grid means we might actually be able to keep our air conditioners on through summer. So, yeah, that's one it's always fascinated me is batteries are a big way of solving problems, but for some reason we don't seem to encourage the purchase of them. But maybe I'm
I
alone in
think
thinking that.
did Labor come out with the policy going into the election about sort of a 30% rebate or something on batteries households?
Yeah, they definitely
So
came in with something.
yeah,
But
yeah,
still that how long is the battery going to last and how quickly you're going to get your money back? So it's sort of that trade-off of is it still worthwhile? Because
yeah,
if you're not going to
yeah.
get your money back for 7 or 8 years, are you going to, prioritize that in your list of spending? So
And let's be frank. I mean, the calculation to understand the payback period and to understand
mm,
the return on investment, there's not many people capable of actually doing that,
mm,
right? Like it is such a difficult thing to sort of ascertain, and yet we're not providing this information to people. We're not giving them a simple way to sort of say, if I go and invest $12,000 into my own home, for example,
mm,
my payback period over that time should be X. And then you can
mm,
make a decision and say, does that actually make sense?
mm,
Just a dumb question out of left field. Does it actually make your house more attractive if you were, let's say, you were selling
mm,
your home and you were selling your home in 2 or 3 years' time or whatever from that point of view, and you were now selling it with batteries, you were now selling it with
mm.
solar. So you'd provision for all this. Doesn't that make your house more attractive and more, I guess, more expensive, I guess, from that point of view, because people are looking at that going, well, that's a good solution.
Yeah,
I'll ask a follow-up question on that. Does selling my EV that's been going for 5 years make my vehicle attractive because I know that there's some battery life issues and to contend
Yeah.
with, So again, it's a terrific question, and I look at it and go, how do we know that? I mean, is it fair for somebody to
Mm.
potentially pay a premium for a motor vehicle, an EV, or pay over the tote for a property because they've been promised the world, but they realize a year in that their solar panels are working at 15% capacity and their battery is at 25% capacity.
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
they're
sure.
both very, very good questions, and I don't think you would be investing in it with the aim of selling it at a profit. I think it's more so one of those ones that if you put 30 grand into it, I reckon you'd lucky to get five back, like as a sort of a benefit for it. Someone might pay a little bit more, but it's not going to be significant. It's really you're investing in it for your own benefit over the long term. So I think to your point, Luke, you're only probably looking at putting these on if you're going to be in the house for the next 10 years, and and that's probably where there is a bit of a gap. People are looking at it going, well, maybe I can save a bit of cash, but do I see myself being here in 5, 10 years time? Older generation might look at it and go, well, am I going to be downsizing in 5, 10 years? Younger generation is probably looking at it going, maybe this isn't my forever home. So yeah, I think you're right. I think there's some challenges that go with that.
Look, one thing I do know is this decarbonation or decarbonisation aspect is, we've got two choices in this debate, and so far we've kind of been dragged to the party, and I think what we've got to do is Australia has a challenge where we've either got to lead it or we're going to continue to be dragged. And I think if we're going to continue to be dragged, then more expensive energy prices, supply interruptions, and a subpar outcome is what we're going to keep on experiencing. And I think Australians have had a gutful. So at this moment in time, I think on the climate change, interestingly enough, at the same time, this very debate, as it's being had, people are now leaving and going, well, we've kicked the Greens out of Parliament, which is an interesting one. So, so it's now being left to the Labor Party, which maybe the electorate has finally decided that actually we need the adults back in the room to make real decisions rather than the people that were causing the ruckus.
Yeah, and look, there's definitely, we've talked about it, gas, nuclear, coal, renewables. We've got it all. We've just got to figure out how to use all of those in the best way forward to get us to this longer term outcome. I think a lot of the focus on we've got to get here, not having the discussion about this is the steps we're going to take to get there. And maybe it means we're using gas, maybe it means we're using coal, and we need to use that for the next 5, 10 years, but it's for the longer term benefit. So, yeah. That maybe, I don't know, probably talking a little bit there, but that's just
I think the opportunity set here really is to consider all options and actually put a framework in and say to the Australian people, this is what we're doing, these are the reasons why, and actually push it through, as opposed to keep pushing it down the road, and next thing you know, we're at another election and we're sitting there saying, what on earth is going on, and why are we still having the same old debate about we don't have enough energy, we don't have enough renewables? Do we need to keep these power plants open longer? So I really think here's your opportunity to the current government to actually make those decisions and run with it. And but let's see if they're going to be bold enough to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that probably segues us into the next point around housing, which is obviously, it's the sort of headline of this is it's not just a policy, it's a moral obligation. And I reckon you could go through the last 3, 4 elections as a minimum around this being the key talking point is we're just not building enough, and there's not enough places for people to live. And on top of that, migration numbers being high, it's putting more stress on the housing market. And I think it's pretty clear that as much as I'm a country person and people like living in the country, people don't want to live 300 k's away from capital cities and key infrastructure. So it's really about we've got to find a way to get more houses closer to the city so people can benefit from those. But I mean, gents, there's a number of things that we can talk about here. I might start with you, Mick. There's already things we've talked about. We just can't use them at the moment. That's a good starting point, I think.
Yeah. Look, from my perspective, we keep banging on about we need to create the housing and do all that, but without actually a plan in place. So, like for example, I read an article recently that there's 8,000 unsold apartments in Melbourne at the moment, right? So we also need to make sure that whatever's being built is actually going to be utilised, right? You want to step up the ante. China got 1.4 billion people. They're having their own property conniptions at the moment. They've got 90 million empty housing units. Like they genuinely have, ghost towns of, imagine the Docklands and nobody there. They've got stuff like that over there. So as part of the broader picture, we need to be talking about what sort of housing, do we want to be building? Should we be looking at build to rent situations and giving institutions incentives to go and do that? Our superannuation funds, they love an unlisted property trust, they love infrastructure. Like, is this an opportunity for some of Australia's retirement savings to be invested into something that will actually be perceived? My thoughts around this is that I think we come from the starting point. We always throw around the great Australian dream of home ownership. And I think the government has a bit of this about them as well. not everybody wants to own a home. And I think the younger generation, perhaps they're sort of going, oh, maybe lifestyle first, maybe not a 30-year mortgage for me.
Mm.
And so, do we give them those options?
And if you're able
I,
to give them a nice new modern apartment in a good location close to all the amenities and say you can have a 5-year term on that, correct me, does that change the thinking at the moment? A lot of the concern is after a year, my landlord's going to boot me out, or they're going to increase my rent significantly. A 5-year lease or something like that with fixed income, fixed indexation limits might very much change that debate pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think it's a
I think
different.
yeah. I think it does, Tim. I think it does change, that sort of stuff. And I think just listening to the two of you speak, the old notion of owning your own home and all that kind of stuff, that's from a bygone era, Mick. And that was from, the old Menzies in terms of that, and everybody, the whole theory was by owning a home, you became a little capitalist. And by becoming a little capitalist, you became a liberal voter. So that was the theory, yeah? So this is how it all, and that's been bashed into our heads. And thinking about it today, if the median house price is $1 million, all right, and your average loan term is 30 years, you, the person who's buying that home, at $1 million worth of borrowings, that's $33,000 a year in capital, no interest. All right. So the young kids have also checked out of that whole scenario. The other thing that you also raised earlier today, Tim, which I actually didn't think about, is the inheritance side. The generation coming through, the younger kids coming through, are going to inherit assets. Their mums and dads, their grandparents are rich and so on. So they're sitting back going, why should I give up my lifestyle and do these sorts of things? Because I'm going to get the asset anyway. So the question that I always have is, who's going to buy these assets in return? We can't be guaranteed that property is always going to rise. But I think the biggest issue around housing is that we keep on looking at the federal government going, we need direction here. But it is a function of all layers of government. So it's at a federal level, it's at a state level, and it's also at a council level. And it is the most over-regulated market we have in this country. And we've got to stop all that. And we've got to remove half the things, because all these regulations, all these things add cost and add to time and so on. So just to get an estate release, it takes X amount of time. Just to get blocks cut up, it takes X amount of time and so on from that point of view. And what it's doing, it's causing the young, and it's causing the young to become disenchanted with the whole process. Because the reality is, one, they can't afford it. And two, if they could, from a time point of view, it's that far down the horizon, it makes no sense to them. So what we've really got to do is start looking at that. And I think from a government perspective, the government's really got to look at areas of saying to local and state governments are going, well, okay, how do we promote rezonings? What are the incentives that we can offer from that point of view? And also build the infrastructure in advance. Because the biggest issue is they finally get this stuff to come out, it finally gets rezoned and so on, and they've still got 2 carriageway roads leading into an estate that has now 40,000 people living in it, trying to get out all at 8 o'clock in the morning. It just doesn't make sense to anybody. So, a bit of thinking, and this is where, I guess, because we're over-bureaucratised, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing half the time.
And I think what you mentioned there is spot on. It's not difficult to do an analysis and say, okay, this area is where people want to live and there's not enough houses for them to live, therefore we're 10,000 houses short in that area. How are we going to add 10,000 houses to there? Well, maybe it sounds a bit horrible. We're going to bulldoze a whole block of houses or something, and we're going to build mass units or apartments that are designed to rent. They're not going to be for people to buy. Therefore, we're going to put supply back into the renter market. People can live where they want. And maybe as part of that, Luke, and this is purely talking off the top of my head, part of your development is we're going to give you mass tax concessions to build this city in a way of apartments. But in return, you've got to build us a school or a childcare centre or a kinder. I don't know, but you've got to build something that's going to return value to that community. That's going to stop the government having to build that. So just food for thought. I don't know if that makes sense.
And Tim, this is where the future fund, this is where the big superannuation funds, from that point of view, who are looking for defensive characteristic assets.
Yep.
All right. So they're looking for consistent income from that point of view. And particularly as Australia now tips over and we're now going to be more in the consumption phase than we are in the accumulation phase, this makes sense. So if you can pick up a 4 or a 5% return, with incremental growth, and that's just coming in consistently from that point of view with guaranteed indexing, it starts to make life that so much easier from that point of view. And it's not now market related. It's not taking the risks of all those sorts of things from that point of view. So for mine, look, I think that idea of finding ways for these super funds to get the tax concessions and the likes and the future funds to do all these sorts of things, I don't know if this is the space that mum and dad's playing. You know, to sit here and say the housing crisis is caused by negative gearing is a fallacy. That's not half the story. You know, we've kind of missed the boat. And to sit here and say it's because of the CGT discount, yeah, the CGT discount probably hasn't helped prices in terms of rising, but it's not the cause of the problem itself. This is a failure of government policy, and not current. You know, this is a failure of government policy 30 years ago, and we're now dealing with the crisis because we've been kicking the can down the road. And I think the thing that worries us is what does it look like in 10 years, 20 years? And I do think, and I'll stand by this, if the Labor Party gets this wrong, they lose the next election.
Yeah, I've mentioned that.
I have no doubt about that.
That's a big talk.
I reckon there's a whole heap of policy errors that are occurring in front of our very eyes now. You know, like you look at what's happening in our home state here in Victoria. You know, with the new land tax and all that. There is, you know, I looked at it last night. There's 2,000 properties for sale on the Mornington Peninsula. That's not going to solve the housing crisis, right? Why? Because people don't work out there, right? You know, it doesn't help me to have a place in Sorrento because I work in the CBD, right? So, you know, we're doing all this stuff on the fly. It's actually causing a fair bit of heartache and disruption there, but it actually doesn't solve anything. And that's the issue here.
No.
And you mentioned it. So I think you mentioned it before, Mick. Like, you know, superannuation, does it become an income stream, not a capital lump sum withdrawal type thing? Well, if you've got superannuation funds mass building these build to rent sort of situations, that's generating yield for the super funds, which can then go towards paying out income streams for clients. So, you know, there's some merit in those ideas. It's just, as we said, you're going to have to. I think, Luke, is it NIMBY? Is that the acronym that you use? Like, everyone thinks it's a great idea, just not next door to their house.
Not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard, exactly.
Yep.
So is it a mentality shift around that, or is it just, you know, and politics play a large part in this? If it's your electorate and it's a minority, it's like a very tight, what's it called? It's right on the edge in terms of whether you hold that seat or you lose it. Probably not going to go attacking that seat pretty hard with mass changes to build, you know, rent to build sort of things, because they're not considered attractive for the voter. But I think there's a lot to explore in that particular space.
I was just going to say these, you know, and we need to look outside of our backyard here too. Look at what's happening globally, right? I mean, we're at the end of the day, we're not a small country by geographic size and the like, but we are by population. You know, if you look at what's happening in the US and in Europe and the like, you know, they've been evolving in this multifamily property type scenarios for a very long time. You know, they've actually got you know, retirees that are happy not to be homeowners, you know, and guess what? They consume, right? They're using, you know, they're not hoarding all this wealth. They're actually using it for consumption purposes. You know, I look at what's happening in the US. We've got some private equity stuff there where, you know, student accommodation. You know, this stuff is like 90% occupied. The big institutions love it. It's just good yield generating income. This is the stuff our super funds need to be looking at, you know, but looking at it from a how do we invest in it, but also then have a dual purpose benefit for the population.
Exactly. Now, just conscious of time, obviously, and keeping to tick through these, the next talking point where we're going to focus on is growing brains, not just buildings. So naturally, a big talking point here is around, you know, we've got productivity issues, and how do we fix that? And a lot of it is coming back to, we've probably got to get better at educating our kids, and whether that be through childcare or through early education or through school. Some of the key points there, and look, throwing one out there, there's a starting point. One of the policy ideas that we've heard a lot is, do you make childcare free? We've gone a long way to making childcare heavily subsidised over the last couple of years, to the point where you can get, I think it's about 95% like covered in some cases now. So do you go to the extent of making it not just free, but putting more focus on the educators in those rooms to start training the kids from a younger age? Thoughts, gents?
Yeah, look, I think that is a great call, Tim. Look, the reality is we live in a world where mums and dads are both working, yeah? And we live in a world where mums and dads are not working your traditional hours from that point of view. So it's not like factory work where they're coming home at 3 and they walk out and they clock off the card. You know, they might be coming home at 5:30, they might be coming home at 6, they're now stuck in traffic and all those sorts of things. So putting or allowing the framework for kids to be able to go into an environment where they're being looked after and where they're also being taught and educated, where they're actually being exposed. You know, so the reality here is we want to be exposing our children. Like I know, Tim, your wife teaches at school as my wife teaches at school, yeah, and they teach at different schools. And the schools have made a decision that things like AI, things like YouTube and all these sorts of things aren't to be used in schools. We're not preparing the kids for the future. We're actually setting them back and handicapping them to succeed. You know, so the reality here is what we need to do is we need to embrace the technologies that are available. What we also need to do is stop this rubbish of internships where people are sitting there expected to do internships with nursing, social work, whatever it might be from that point of view, or teaching from that end, and not getting paid, and yet required to do 600 or 800 hours of free work. Like, who are you kidding? You know, like, who's going to subsidise this? So little Mary or little Johnny move out of home, they're paying rent, and now they're having to go and do 600 hours or 800 hours of free paid work. That's half a year. You know, it makes no sense.
And I mean, we obviously do work for clients who work in private enterprises and a higher, like, I suppose, at levels all over that private enterprise. And you've got short-term incentive, long-term incentive, all those sort of things built into their salary package. And coming back to the point of teachers, you know, I honestly am scared of how many teachers we're going to lose in the next 5 to 10 years because the stress that's being put on them, a lot of rights returned to children and taken away from teachers. And I'm not here to argue whether that's a good or a bad thing. I'm here to say that's going to put pressure on retaining teachers. So I don't know whether a short-term, long-term incentive sort of thing for teachers is an option. Just putting it out there and saying we've got to find a way to get more teachers into that occupation, and obviously good candidates who are going to teach the next generation and generations of our Australia. But yeah, got to find a way to do that, because at the moment I just have this real fear, not just speaking to my wife, but obviously speaking to teaching fraternities, there's going to be some issues there.
Without question. The other thing there, Tim, is too, the education system hasn't kept up with the new world. So if you think about it, we're still teaching via rote. We're still teaching in the classroom format. And if you think about the way the work environment works, it's all about collaboration. You know, we're all sitting around tables. We're all inputting data. It's just the education system is still built for the 1900s, and we're in 2025. So, you know, from a productivity perspective, you know, if we are interested in productivity and all that, and this is not about trying to get people to work more hours. That's not the logical answer. This is about getting people to use their talents and harnessing those talents to produce better outcomes. You know, people are smart enough. There's no question about that. We're just not utilising them to their fullest potential. And I think, unfortunately, with teaching, Tim, and this, you know, Mirko, I'm sure you'd agree, anything we do in teaching today, we're not going to see the economic benefit from this or the dividend from this for 30, 40 plus years. But we're seeing the consequences of inaction of the last 30, 40 years now. That's the problem. And this is where, you know, this is where the bravery and the boldness of government needs to think and go, well, actually, you know, and if you think about Gonski and funding and all that, and that was really around trying to limit the gap between the haves and the have-nots. I don't believe that's been successful. I don't think we've addressed that anywhere near the issue. And if we look at the education standards, we're not seeing an increase in our education standards either. So that seems to have failed.
And that's gonna cause, you know, what, you know, we're already seeing a brain drain. So people see, you know, leaving our shores that have got so much to offer because it's just not worthwhile and palatable doing it here. But you know, the system's fundamentally wrong when, you know, we're losing nurses from hospitals to go work on big build projects because they're like, I've trained all my life. I actually wanted to add some real value here and help the community. Yet I can get paid 3 times as much on a government funded big. You know, we're actually creating these problems, right? You know,
the other problem. Sorry, Mick, to interrupt you, but even on the NDIS, you can get paid $60 an hour, Monday through to Friday, to be providing care or going out and doing or whatever you might be doing from that point of view. And I'm not saying it's an easy job, but compared to nursing, they're not getting paid $60 an hour.
Well, I mean, they're trying to resolve this now, but right now, there's places where I can train in nursing and never step foot in a hospital and go and work in the injectables industry, smashing out Botox and fillers and whatnot, and I get a hell of a lot of money than I ever will as a nurse, right? What are we creating? Yeah,
Yeah.
and and to me, I look at that and we talk about grow brains, and I think that sort of then ties into growing entrepreneurship and encouraging it, and we just don't see enough of it here. Probably a topic for another time, but Australia doesn't have what the US has, and being prepared to deploy non-dilutive capital, for example. Over there, if they see a dual use, good for defense, good for government, good for the broader population, good for commercial use, they will actually pump money into it, not wanting anything in return apart from get the job done and get this out there because people are going to benefit. We have very little of that here. It's so hard to come by, There's so many people competing for so little funding. And, and I'm not surprised that people end up, working in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of Aussie accents in Silicon Valley doing some unbelievable things because it's not worth doing it here.
Absolutely. I think it is a great point, that particular one of the talent. We're trying to talk about retaining talent here, and the amount we're losing overseas is just insane. Next point I was going to
Sorry, Tim. No. Sorry, Tim, just on that point, what an opportunity now, if you think about what Trump's doing in the United States and the fight that he's having with Harvard, that Trump is wanting to limit, the foreigners coming in and whatever, which if you think about in the US, all the biggest inventions that they've had have been from people coming into their country, and studied at their universities and so on, and then gone on to bigger and better things from that point of view. What an opportunity now, if we wanted to, or if we were able to attract those people, because if America doesn't want them, why can't Australia target them?
No arguments for me here.
Our best business schools should be putting their hands up and saying, hey, weak Australian dollar, we'll recognise your 2 years at Harvard. Come here and finish your degree.
Absolutely. What a bargain. And what a country to live in.
Exactly. When you can get houses close to infrastructure and not have to live out in Sorrento and commute to work. Yeah, I digress.
All right.
The next point we're going to talk about is obviously, and this is not really a surprise, is the boomers and they're retiring. And I think all three of us on the screen would agree, even though we've known about this for a long time, we're not ready for this right now in terms of the cost that is going to have and the drain on, the people leaving the workforce that have got a lot of skills, social security, all these other bits and pieces there. But, one of the concepts that we've sort of heard a lot talked about is rather than focusing on trying to provide care for them, and I'm not saying we don't provide care for them, we do obviously, but is there some focus that we can put now to stop those health issues occurring in the future? Is there some preventative health things that we can start focusing on to make Australia healthy longer term, rather than the other side of that coin where we're directing all our attention to treating at the other end? I know it's a fine line because we need people at both sides, but one particular concept we could be looking at.
I think at the moment we tend to deal with the symptoms, right, as opposed to dealing with the cause. And I think that the earlier that we can sort of intervene and the like, the better. I recently heard a speaker talking about something that they're rolling out in the US from a healthcare and social services point of view. And and the point was made, and the numbers might be a little bit different, but they still make sense. Is it not better to solve the shelter crisis for somebody at $18 a day, or the malnourishment at $16 a day, than have to wait for them to be picked up under a bridge with pneumonia and spend $28,000 resolving that issue, and then doing it all over again next winter, right? And we don't have that mindset. We're sort of dealing with it down the track, and and even when we do decide to roll out a plan, a la the aged care reforms, what we do today, let's buy ourselves another few months because we're certainly not ready to go with this.
Yeah, not ready to roll that one out.
I think for mine, and I think we're going to talk about the vested interest there, Mirko, in the sense that the pharmaceutical companies make no money out of you being healthy. And the problem is when you've got these guys here, and the lobbyists getting into the government's ear and providing them with funding and donations and, the support, this is what happens, and we, the consumer, end up suffering from this point of view. Like, with the ageing population, I think there's a couple of things that we need to consider. I think at this moment in time, something like an aged care levy, like a Medicare thing, that is, that's something that you could probably float. That really sits uncomfortably with me because I sit back and think, well, why does the younger generation have to pay for it? It's not their fault, Maybe it is the pension environment and superannuation funds that covers it. Maybe that's what we use the money for. So maybe you can turn around and say, well, okay, that's how we're going to fund it, and that's what we're going to use the money for. I do think we need to look at ways of keeping older Australians in the workforce for longer. I do think there is some bias there where a lot of talented people might stop working at 55 or 60 from that point of view, would like to keep on working, but they can't find new work or work which is relevant to their skill sets. Not because they're no good, but people just look at it and there's a bit of that, and there might be some incentives for employers to perhaps to employ and keep them on. So a bit like the apprenticeship scheme on the younger side, maybe on the other side from that point of view. So I think we need to look at that. I think we also probably need to have a real discussion around the the age pension system. The age pension system now, the asset test is now just over $1 million now again for a couple.
Yeah,
it's starting to get that. I wouldn't say it's generous, but today, a couple with $1 million or well over just over $1 million from that point of view gets what, 40 grand in interest a year, and a couple with nothing gets $40,000 or $45,000 in age pension, and you're kind of sitting back going, these asset tests needs to be adjusted in some way or form. It doesn't feel right, and maybe access or universal access to the pension card and its benefits because there's a thank you, but you don't get a payment. We've got to start looking at these sorts of things because at this moment in time, what we've got, and if we think about the population coming through, that system's going to break. It's just there is not enough money in the system to pay for the age pension, to pay for aged care, and then for the increasing healthcare costs on this side. Like this is a time bomb waiting to blow.
An interesting, I hadn't thought of that, Luke, but we talk about the superannuation system today for accumulators has a 15% tax, pension phase has got 0% tax. Why don't we just whack an extra 2% tax in there and say that 2% tax is your aged care levy or something like that? Because guess what? It's not going to impact the younger generation as much as it's going to impact the older generation. So not a bad one you've just thought up there. I'm sure you weren't going down that path, but while you were talking, that just came to mind. So
hey Tim, the scary part is that's probably how the discussion and the research into that will actually play out in Parliament. They'll go, hey, why don't we just whack a 2% tax on this and be done with it? That's how a lot of this policy has been created, I reckon.
Yeah, and the other point that you made around the age pension, Luke, is naturally at the moment you can call it potentially say $900,000 in superannuation and still get a pension because you are going to have lifestyle assets, cars, etc. There are cases where people have got well over $1 million and still getting access to a pension because of whose name that's held in and the age of that person. So maybe they look at it and go, no longer it's dependent on what your age is. Maybe it's dependent on do you have access to it. If you have access to that superannuation, that's now accessible.
Wow.
So
I don't know if you guys picked up what was in the Sydney Morning Herald the other day, but there's some whispers about the official retirement age going to 70 from 67. So I think it's a bit like some of the other stuff we're starting to hear. Yeah, I think it may be. I think that retirement age may resolve itself.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. If it happened tomorrow, I'd be going, yeah, probably saw that coming.
Yep. I agree. All right, just and mindful of time, the last thing we've got to do is, sensible savings and what we need to do there. One of the things that we've all got, and I think we'd all agree, is that we have got a lot of expenditures that are now going on. And this is probably one of those big issues that we as a society need to look back. And one of the biggest issues are the overruns and the over budgets and, what we said and then what the cost blowouts were. And Mirko, back to your initial point earlier today, nobody's responsible from that point of view. What are some of the things, I guess, what are some of the things that people are talking about in this area? Because this seems to probably be one of those biggest areas of frustration for people, because money is being spent and then all of a sudden, a bit like the suburban rail thing, great idea, but no money in the can, and all of a sudden we've had cost blowouts, and this thing just keeps on getting bigger and bigger than Ben-Hur.
When you say no one's responsible for it, the taxpayers are responsible for it. Yeah,
Correct.
I know
True.
I know you're not deliberately doing that.
I think the hospital reform is we've got to do something because the system is just bursting at the seams at the moment, and we've got a huge issue with even with the private health system, the way it's structured and how much it costs. And I mean, you look at we look at household budgets day in, day out. And one of the biggest numbers that leave household budgets is the cost of private health cover. And it's simply not sustainable for people. And you look at it, and I always think to myself, imagine if we didn't have legislated tax rules that basically forced me to have private health cover, what that would do to private health ownership in the system. I reckon it would completely collapse. And we know the public system can't cope. The private health system can't cope at the moment. So we need some significant reforms around that. Retirees fall off that tax system. They're the ones that are going to be cancelling their cover. They're the ones that are going to need the most assistance there. So that's one of the first ones that come to mind for me.
Yeah, it's a really, really good one, that one. And probably what comes to mind for me is around the NDIS and the wastage that goes through that system. Obviously, a lot of money gets directed into that, but as we know it, you've got the patients that need it. You've got the government at this end, in the middle, you've got this sort of middleman, and too much money gets lost through that middleman, that provider in the middle there, 30-40% of it in some cases. And another thing, and Mick touched on this earlier on, is, we got a shortage of people working in this particular space. One of the issues I've seen, having dealt with a couple of NDIS providers, is they can bill to drive an hour to see that client for an hour, and then bill to drive an hour coming back. So they're getting paid for the 3 hours, two of them on the road. But yet you've got those 2 hours could have been spent dealing with another patient or seeing someone else or helping somewhere else. So there's wastage in terms of their time. So, for them, I mean, don't get me wrong, if I've got the option of sitting in a car, listening to a podcast and cruising along, it's a pretty empowering sort of decision for them to make, to go get a bit of time back, bit of peace and quiet. I'm getting paid for it. Why wouldn't I? So yeah, there's a bit of an issue there.
Yeah, no, agree with those two boys. And I think probably the other one there is digital government transformation. I would really think that we've got to look at that. And if we're talking about, where we can automate things and where we can and make the interactions easier and remove bureaucracy, because at the moment you think about the multiple steps and if you think about MyGov in terms of what MyGov can do, the power of MyGov's pretty enormous in terms of it interacts with the ATO, interacts with Centrelink and the likes and all those sorts of things, and they're forcing people down this route, which is kind of cool. But then think of this and go, well, can we bring in like the SRO and bring in all these sorts of things and have this one place where we're not having to deal with multiple peoples from that point of view and make life that so much easier, I guess, from that end. Because at this moment in time, just trying to navigate all these services, trying to understand all these services is next to nigh impossible. In saying that, let's also remember we do have older people in Australia who aren't technologically savvy. So we need to have a transition plan to help these guys as well, because we just can't expect them to go and buy a mobile phone either.
Absolutely. Not just a mobile phone, a smartphone with apps and all these other bits and pieces
Or,
that come with
it. Or maybe they can buy a fax machine, because Centrelink only take faxes on certain forms.
Good. Well picked up. That for people, that is sadly true. That's not made up. That's sadly true. Anyway, so the topic of the conversation today was, will Anthony Albanese be bold, be brave, or will he sit by the sidelines? We have just talked about so many different things that could be brought into the coalface and debated and potentially passed. And if you passed all the things we've spoken about today, there'd be a lot more money in the budget to spend on things. But I don't think he's going to go in that path. I think he'd lose the 90 seats that he won if he enforced all of those. But definitely going to be some of those that will come to fruition or at least be talked about. So I don't know, Luke, have you got anything else you'd like to say before we wrap it up?
Tim, I hope you're right. I hope he is brave, and I hope the government actually grows a pair and actually does something for the betterment of the country, both today and tomorrow. My fear is, however, is in 3 years' time, we'll be sitting back reviewing this podcast or this video and going, we've missed all those things.
Not a bad idea, actually, Luke. You go back and review it and go, how many of those things we threw out there did they pass? So yeah, I think that's
We
good.
will do that in 2028. I look forward to Judgment Day. See how bold they were.
Just before the next election. I like it. Well, hopefully that's given some
Good on
people
you, buddy.
a bit of context into some of the things that are potentially there. And will he be bold? Will he be brave? Will he simply sit back and just keep doing what he did the last term, as a lot of people put it? So we'll wait and see. As Mick said, 3 years to figure that part out. But hopefully you've enjoyed today's session. Back on Friday with a weekly wrap as always. And next pulse check session next end of this month, sorry, which will be nearly 30 June. So plenty to talk about then, no doubt. So hopefully you've enjoyed that, everyone, and we'll be back again soon.
See you guys.
Okay, guys. Ciao.